Welcome to the History in Focus channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one.
The Second World War has faces that no school textbook dared to show. While the world debated battles and strategies, a systematic crime was being carried out. 200,000 women, perhaps more, nobody knows for certain, were kidnapped, deceived, and turned into property of the Imperial Japanese Army. The world took 50 years to hear what they had to say. They had a name for it. Not sexual slavery, not war crime. The official name was Yanfu, comfort women, a soft expression to cover a horror that crossed borders, cultures, and decades of denial. This video will tell what happened inside those barracks, what the military documents recorded, and what the survivors carried for the rest of their lives. Yanfu, in the Japanese of the era, it meant woman who serves for comfort. The term was chosen carefully, soft enough to appear in official documents, vague enough not to provoke questioning. Behind it was a system of sexual slavery administered by the state itself, which captured women in at least 12 different countries and turned them into property of the Imperial Army. This is the story that Japan took 50 years to acknowledge. Before any fact, it is necessary to understand how it all began. In 1932, after the Battle of Shanghai, the Imperial Japanese Army created the first official comfort station. The pretext was to prevent soldiers from committing sexual crimes against civilians, which would create diplomatic tensions. The solution found was to formalize the crime, centralize the violence, organize it, administer it. Individual assault was inconvenient. Institutionalized assault was not. The system grew in silence for 5 years. In 1937, everything changed. After the Nanjing Massacre, where Japanese soldiers murdered and violated tens of thousands of Chinese civilians in weeks, the army radically expanded the comfort stations. Officially, to prevent episodes like Nanjing from repeating. In practice, to redirect the violence to a controlled and invisible channel. The solution to the massacre was another massacre, just more organized. Starting in 1937, the stations multiplied across all of Asia. China, Korea, the Philippines, Burma, Indonesia, Pacific Islands. They followed the army like a shadow. In some territories, they were one of the first structures erected after conquest, before hospitals, before permanent warehouses. The comfort of the soldiers was a first-order logistical priority. And to feed this system, the army needed women, many women. The recruitment began. Fact 1, the soldiers called them public toilets. The Imperial Japanese Army did not call those women slaves, victims, or prisoners. The official name was Yanfu, comfort women. But among the soldiers, the name was different. They were called public toilets, an object for collective use, something you use, soil, and discard. That word reveals more about the Japanese system than any official document could. The comfort stations were official military structures, administered by the army itself. They were not clandestine wartime brothels. They were planned, built, and supervised facilities like any other military resource. They had fixed schedules, organized lines, and internal regulations. What happened inside them was treated with the same bureaucratic coldness used to manage a weapons depot or a food storage building. The numbers reveal the scale of the horror. The women served between 25 and 35 soldiers per day. Not per week, per day. In some camps, the schedules were fixed at 15 minutes per soldier during the day and 30 minutes for officers at night. The line started before dawn and only ended when the last man was served. There was no rest, there was no refusal, there was no choice. To use the stations, soldiers bought access coupons at the unit's supply office, as if they were buying rations or equipment. Each coupon had a fixed value, an expiration date, and specified the time allowed. The woman received the coupon, which was later exchanged for payment to the station operator. She never touched the money directly. This ticket system created a documentary chain that decades later would become irrefutable proof of what had happened, and that Japan tried to burn in 1945. Think about what it meant to exist inside the system. You were not assaulted by a man with a name. You were processed by a flow with a schedule. There was a numbered door, a disciplined line, timed duration, and a control coupon. The violence had been so completely transformed into procedure that the perpetrators themselves could carry it out without seeing themselves as such. The public toilet had no feelings, and the man who used a toilet did not need to have them either. Fact 2, the youngest victims were 12 or 13 years old, and it was documented. These are not rumors. These are not activist exaggerations. These are medical records, reports from Allied officers who captured Japanese camps, and testimonies collected while the war was still going on. The Japanese Army did not establish a minimum age for admission to the stations. No regulation, no written restriction. If the body served the purpose, it was admitted. Childhood was not protection. It was merely irrelevant information for those who organized those camps. The poorest families were the preferred targets. Recruiters arrived with offers of domestic work or funded education, offers impossible to refuse for parents who could not feed their children. Some handed over their daughters genuinely believing they would return with money and instruction. Others suspected, but had no choice in the face of misery and the pressure of agents who represented Japanese colonial power. Poverty was the second trap. The first was the lie. 12-year-old girls did not understand what was happening when they arrived at the stations. Survivors reported decades later that, at that moment, they did not even have the vocabulary to name what they were experiencing. The shock was not only physical, it was the collapse of a reality that had not yet had time to form. They were destroyed before they fully existed. The physical damage to such young bodies was devastating and immediate. Doctors who examined survivors after the war documented permanent injuries, infertility, and irreversible internal damage caused by repeated abuse before full physical development. The Army knew this. The medical inspections recorded the conditions. No regulation established that girls could not be admitted to the stations. The silence of the rules was, in itself, an authorization. Colonial Korea was the preferred source for the recruitment of young girls. The Japanese educational system had inserted agents into schools and rural communities. Teachers, colonial officials, and local intermediaries actively participated in the identification and delivery of candidates. Girls who left for school in the morning did not come home at night. The families were informed afterward, when there was already enough distance for any search to be useless. Some survivors reported that they only discovered their ages and the dimension of what had happened long after the war, when colonial documents were partially opened. They did not know they were 12 or 13 years old when they were taken. They had no birth certificate. The Japanese colonial system had produced a generation of children without papers, without records, and without legal protection, which made their disappearance even easier to erase. The psychological trauma of girls in that age range was of a different nature from that of adult women, not because it was greater or lesser, but because it struck the development of identity at a stage when it had not yet occurred. Psychologists who worked with survivors decades later described cases in which the adult woman had built her entire personality around the silence about that period. The secret was not a part of life. It was the foundation upon which the entire life had been built. What made the situation of these girls even more devastating was the total absence of any protective structure. There was no international organization monitoring the treatment of civilians. There was no applied convention that covered them. There was no reporting channel. The world that could have intervened did not even know it was happening. And the few who knew were on the side of those who organized the camps. The invisibility was as absolute as the violence. When the war ended, these girls, the ones who survived, returned home carrying something none of them could name. There was no word available in the vocabulary of their cultures to describe what they had lived through. There was no diagnosis, no protocol, no support. There was only silence, and the expectation that it would stay that way forever. Some were 15 years old when the world was rebuilt around them. The world was rebuilt. They were not. Fact 3. The Army taught how to calculate the perishability of women. At some point, an officer of the Imperial Japanese Army sat at a desk and wrote a management manual for military brothels. It is not a metaphor. It is a documented fact. The Army offered accounting courses on how to administer comfort stations, including how to calculate, with clinical precision, the durability or perishability of the recruited women. That phrase was in official training documents. Durability or perishability of the recruited women. That expression was in training materials distributed to officers. It meant how long a woman could function before being rendered useless by disease, exhaustion, or death. It was an equation. The denominator was a human being. No officer who received that manual questioned the language. None recorded an objection. It was the normal vocabulary of a normal machine. The system was so institutionalized that it generated its own bureaucracy. There were forms to register the women, medical reports to monitor their condition, transfer orders when a unit moved. The women were not forgotten prisoners in a basement. They were cataloged resources, transported and redistributed according to the strategic needs of the Army, like bales of rice, like crates of ammunition. There were periodic medical inspections, not to protect the women, to protect the soldiers. Women with visible symptoms were temporarily removed from service. The rest continued regardless of how they felt. The medical checkup at the stations was, in practice, quality control. The women were the product. The inspection was about the product, never about the person. Igusa documented this. Then he spent decades in silence before writing. The most disturbing thing is the normalcy with which everything was treated. There were no records of internal protests. There were no officers who refused to administer the stations. The machinery turned because each part did its job without questioning. Educated men with families, with children, arrived at the stations, opened the books, and did the calculations. The banality of evil had an address, a schedule, and a spreadsheet, and it worked perfectly. Fact 4. They were captured with promises of factory jobs. Few women arrived at the comfort stations knowing what awaited them. The majority were captured by the oldest trap in the world, the promise of a better life. Agencies contracted by the Army traveled through villages in Korea, China, and the Philippines with offers of jobs in factories, field hospitals, and domestic services. The pay was good, the conditions excellent. All lies. When the women arrived at the promised destination, they found something different. There was no factory. There was no hospital. There was a line of soldiers and a door. Some recruiters were ordinary civilians who sold the women directly to the army. Others were intermediaries paid per head. The business was profitable, and the army turned a blind eye to the methods, as long as the quotas were filled within the established deadline. The Kempitai, the Japanese military police, was directly responsible for cases of open coercion. Documents and testimonies record soldiers and agents breaking into homes, tearing women away from their families, and taking them by force. In some cases, they promised the families that their daughters would return in a few months. It was a promise that would never be kept. Many never saw their families again. Some never returned. The first victims were not Korean or Chinese. They were Japanese. Poor women from Japan itself were the first to be trafficked to the military brothels. After the army discovered that the stations created diplomatic tension when the victims were foreign, but demand grew faster than local supply, and soon recruitment expanded to the colonies and occupied territories without any limit of conscience. The machinery of the crime needed innocence, and it went looking exactly where it knew it would find it, in poor villages, in desperate families, in women without options. The system that cataloged women as supplies knew it would never find enough volunteers, so it built an architecture of lies to capture those who would never have accepted if they had known the truth. The first violence was the false promise. What came after was its fulfillment. Fact 5. The race of the woman determined which rank could use her. Inside the comfort stations, the violence was not egalitarian. There was a brutal hierarchy based on race, origin, and rank of the client. At the top of this perverse pyramid were the Dutch women captured in the Dutch East Indies. They were reserved exclusively for officers, as if the color of skin were a criterion for distributing military resources, and it was exactly that. Korean women made up the largest portion of the system. Research based on medical records of the Imperial Army from 1940 indicates that Korean women represented more than 51% of the total comfort women. They were the most numerous group, the most exploited, and the most invisible, because Korea was a Japanese colony, and the colonized, in imperial logic, had no rights that needed to be respected. At the bottom of the hierarchy were indigenous women and those of mixed origin. Some were girls born to Japanese fathers and Papuan mothers, daughters of the colonizers themselves. The fact that they had Japanese blood did not protect them. It made them disposable in an even more absurd way. They were a product of the imperial system itself, being devoured by the same system that had created them. The frontier of horror had no logic. It only had cruelty. The Japanese military police, the Kempitai, forced and coerced interned women to serve as prostitutes, including several hundred European women. There were written orders regulating who could have access to them. The body of a European woman was worth more, according to the racist logic of the army, than that of an Asian woman. Both were victims. The difference between them was merely administrative. The horror was equally real. This hierarchy revealed something deeper than individual cruelty. It revealed that the system had a coherent logic, perverse but coherent. Race, rank, origin, everything was calculated, nothing was chaotic. The horror of the comfort stations was not the result of uncontrolled soldiers. It was the result of very controlled men executing a very well-planned system with clear rules about who was worth how much. Fact 6. A doctor saw women crying and begging, and did nothing. The military doctor Aigusa arrived at the comfort station doing the work assigned to him, checking the health of the women. What he saw was recorded in his memoirs decades later. The women continued working even while sick. Even with fever, they cried while they waited. They begged for help, and nobody came. Nobody interfered. The system kept functioning. Venereal diseases spread with devastating speed. Syphilis and gonorrhea were endemic in the stations. The treatments of the era were primitive, injections of mercury compounds that frequently caused more damage than the infection. Women who contracted serious diseases were removed, not to recover, but to make room for the next ones. The system needed functioning bodies. Healed bodies were a detail without operational relevance. Aigusa wrote that the women begged not to leave, but only for a single day of rest. One single day. And even that was denied. He documented it. Then he spent decades in silence before writing his memoirs. Aigusa's silence was not cowardice. It was the silence of an entire generation of men who saw, participated, and then chose not to speak. The testimony arrived late. The victims, even earlier. Think about what it meant to wake up every day in that situation. To know what the day had in store. To know there was no escape. To know that even getting sick would not stop the obligation to continue. The border between life and death inside those stations was measured in days of remaining usefulness. When a woman ceased to be useful, she ceased to exist for the system. Fact 7. There is one single positive account, and deniers use it to this day. Among all the records about comfort women, there is one account that completely diverges from all the others. American documents based on testimonies of Korean women captured after the siege of Myitkyina in Burma describe comparatively better conditions, gifts, payments, a certain freedom of movement. This account became the anchor of decades of organized historical denial. The Myitkyina case is real. The documents exist. But they need to be read in the context in which they were produced. The interrogations were conducted by American officers with little or no knowledge of Korean, with improvised interpreters, about women who had just come out of a combat zone and had every reason not to reveal their real situation. What reached the paper was a version filtered through trauma, fear, and language barriers. This account was systematically used by Japanese deniers for decades as if it were proof that the entire system was voluntary and benevolent, ignoring hundreds of other testimonies, ignoring the Kempitai records, ignoring Igusa's memoirs. A single ambiguous document was turned into a shield against all the others. That is how historical denial works. It does not need to prove everything. It only needs one doubt planted in the right place. The women who survived were used a second time, now to deny what they themselves had lived through. The same American army that produced those reports never used them as proof of acceptable conditions. Decades later, they were recontextualized by Japanese politicians as if they were absolution. History was not revised, it was hijacked. The crime continued. It had only changed form and address. Fact 8. Many died abandoned inside bombed camps. Many of the comfort women never had the chance to testify, to process, or to seek justice. Not because they chose silence, but because they did not survive. Since they were forced to accompany the army on battlefields and combat zones, they were present when Allied forces destroyed Japanese encampments in the Pacific. They died in the same explosions that hit the soldiers around them. There was no evacuation plan for comfort women when the encampments were attacked. Soldiers had retreat orders. The women, at most, received one instruction: stay here. Some were abandoned on islands while the army retreated. Others were killed by the Japanese themselves, so they would not fall alive into enemy hands and testify to what had happened. The silence was guaranteed with direct violence. The numbers of the extermination were never tallied. There is no record of how many died in the stations, from disease, exhaustion, or direct violence. There is no record of how many died in Allied bombings. There is no record of how many were executed during the Japanese retreat. The system that cataloged every woman while she was useful recorded absolutely nothing when they ceased to exist. The Japanese army burned documents en masse in the final days of the war. Entire archives disappeared. What remained was enough to prove the system existed, but insufficient to prove its complete scale. The women who died in that war have no names on any memorial. They have no grave. They have no headstone. They have only the silence of countries that preferred to move forward without looking back. Fact 9. Surviving was considered dishonor. Death was what was expected. Surviving the comfort stations was not liberation. It was the beginning of a second condemnation. In cultures deeply shaped by Confucian tradition, any unmarried woman who lost her virginity, for any reason, including violence, was expected to commit suicide. It was not written law. It was a social expectation as powerful as any law, and the survivors knew this better than anyone. Some returned home and told nothing. They invented stories, fabricated pasts, married in silence men who never knew. They carried the trauma alone for decades, afraid not only of judgment, but of destroying their own families by revealing what had happened. The weight was not just personal, it was collective. The shame in those cultures did not belong only to the woman, it stained everyone around her. That is why so many stayed silent. Others could not return, not because they did not want to, because they could not. Families that discovered the past of a daughter expelled her. Communities rejected them, churches excluded them. The woman who had been violated by a state system was punished twice, first by the system, then by the society that should have welcomed her. The available vocabulary had only one word: dishonored. The vocabulary for victim did not yet exist in that world. The cruel paradox is that surviving required a courage that society interpreted as an absence of honor. Dying would have been, in that context, considered noble. Living was the scandal. Every woman who chose to stay alive defied a cultural norm that demanded her death as proof of purity, and she was punished for that choice for the rest of her life. The border between victim and outcast in those societies was invisible and absolutely insurmountable. Fact 10. The crime was buried for 50 years, and the silence was calculated. For nearly 5 decades after the end of the war, the comfort women system existed in a kind of historical limbo. Everyone knew, and nobody spoke. It was not in Japanese textbooks. It did not dominate the debates about war crimes. The focus of historians fell on the Nanjing Massacre and Unit 731. The comfort women were a topic that was too uncomfortable to be confronted head-on. In 1962, the Japanese writer Kaku Senda found photographs of comfort women while researching the Second World War. It was an extraordinary find, but he could not obtain enough information to identify who those women were, where the photographs had been taken, or what had happened to them. The images existed, the stories did not. The silence had been so efficient that not even the photographic trail could be deciphered. On the side of the survivors, the silence had even deeper causes. Women who had lived through the horror of the stations had decades of life built upon the secret. Revealing the past meant destroying marriages, families, and reputations. Some had lied to their own husbands, others to their own children. The cost of speaking was immense, and no government was actively asking to listen, so they continued to stay silent. Official history did not actively deny the system, it simply did not include it. Japanese textbooks described the war without mentioning the comfort stations. Entire generations grew up without knowing what had happened, and when the topic finally emerged, through the courage of women who decided to break the silence, it found a society completely unprepared to receive it. The forgetting was not an accident. The generation that could have testified soon after the war was, at that moment, preoccupied with reconstruction. Japan, Korea, and China had destroyed economies and immediate crises. War crimes of the past were inconvenient in the present. And the comfort women, already elderly, already isolated, already ashamed, had no voice, no platform, and no audience. The silence was convenient for everyone, except for them. Fact 11. 3 women sued Japan and broke 50 years of silence. In December 1991, 3 South Korean women did something no comfort woman had done before. They filed a lawsuit in Japan demanding recognition and compensation. The date was not chosen by chance. It was the 50th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The world was looking at the war. They decided it was time to change what the world was seeing at that moment. The effect was immediate and global. For the first time, the topic of comfort women had a name, a face, and a public voice. In the following months, survivors from the Philippines, China, Indonesia, and other countries began to break their own silence. Decades of secrecy began to dissolve, one testimony at a time. What seemed impossible, a survivor speaking in public became inevitable. The first step breaks the barrier for all the ones that follow. Japan was caught unprepared. The government expected the issue to be resolved with silent diplomacy and discreet compensations. It did not expect cameras. It did not expect 70-year-old women to, with trembling but firm voices, publicly describe what had happened 50 years before. The courage of those women was not just personal, it was strategic. They understood that the only tribunal capable of judging them was world public opinion. The most powerful thing is what those 3 women represented. They were not professional activists. They did not have famous lawyers. They did not have government support. They were elderly women who had carried a secret for 50 years and decided that the silence had lasted long enough. The lawsuit did not generate immediate compensation, but it opened the way for that to happen. Fact 12. Japanese politicians denied the crime publicly, decades after the war. When the silence was broken, the deniers entered the field. In 2012, the former mayor of Osaka, Toru Hashimoto, publicly declared that there was no evidence that comfort women had been taken by force by the Japanese army. It was a statement directly contradicted by hundreds of survivor testimonies, military records, and confessions from veterans. But it was said, and it was widely disseminated as if it carried weight. The most revealing case is that of Chancellor Hirofumi Nakasone. In 2014, he chaired a commission to restore Japan's honor on the comfort women issue. What few people knew, Nakasone's own father had organized a comfort station in 1942 when he was an officer of the Imperial Navy. The son was defending the legacy the father had built. The family had very personal reasons for rewriting history. The manga artist Yoshinori Kobayashi published works that minimized the hardships of comfort women. He included an interview with the Taiwanese industrialist Shi Wenlong, who stated that no woman had been forced and that the conditions were hygienic, with mandatory condoms. The statement directly contradicts the accounts of the survivors, but it had the appeal of a local source, which gave the appearance of internal credibility to the denialist discourse. Kobayashi was criticized by other Japanese academics. Historians within Japan itself publicly contested the conclusions of his works, but academic criticism rarely reaches the same audience as populist discourse. Denial is simpler, more palatable, and more convenient. In societies where questioning the war is still seen as treason, the denier has a guaranteed audience. The truth must compete with convenience. The pattern of denial is always the same. Take the most ambiguous case, like the Meet Kina reports, and generalize it as the rule. Ignore the most documented cases, question the credibility of the survivors without examining the evidence that corroborates them, and frame any recognition as external political pressure. Denial does not need to prove innocence. It only needs to create enough confusion so that responsibility is never formally established. Fact 13. Japan apologized but refused to admit the crime. In 2015, then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe expressed his most sincere apologies and remorse, acknowledging irreparable physical and psychological wounds caused to the women. The words were the ones the survivors had waited decades to hear, but what they came to say shortly after changed everything. They did not want apologies. They wanted legal responsibility. There was an enormous difference between the two, and they knew exactly what it was. An apology is an expression of regret. A recognition of legal responsibility is an admission of a crime. The Japanese government was willing to offer the first, never the second. And the survivors, who had lived through that system, who knew what they had lost, refused the exchange. It was not ingratitude, it was precision. They understood the difference between being lamented by a government and being recognized as a victim of a state crime. The compensation agreement of 2015 between Japan and South Korea was presented as final and irreversible by both governments. The money would be distributed through a foundation. Representatives of the survivors immediately declared that the agreement did not reflect the will of the women and promised to seek its invalidation through legal means. Several survivors refused to receive any amount. Money without responsibility was, for them, a second humiliation. Several women protested against the agreement, stating that they did not want money. They wanted a genuine recognition of legal responsibility from the Japanese government. They were women of nearly 90 years old who still had the energy to refuse what they considered insufficient. Think about what those women were asking for. Not financial reparation, although deserved, not monuments, although necessary. They were asking that a government say, in clear legal terms, what we did was a crime, and we are responsible. That never came. And without that recognition, everything that came before, the apologies, the money, the memorials, was ornament over a wound that was never treated. Japan paid in order not to confess. Fact 14, the documents Japan tried to destroy survived. In 2014, China released what it called irrefutable proof, documents from the archives of the Kempeitai itself and from the National Bank of the Japanese puppet regime in Manchuria. These were not survivor testimonies. They were documents produced by the Japanese themselves about their own operations, in bureaucratic language without ambiguity. The system was written in the words of those responsible for it. Denial became more difficult after that. In 2013, the Peace Monument was inaugurated in Glendale, California, a memorial dedicated to the comfort women. A simple statue, seated with its face turned toward the Japanese consulate in the city. The reaction of the Japanese government was disproportionate. Diplomatic pressure, formal protests, requests for removal. The statue was more bothersome than 50 years of silence. In June 2016, Shanghai Normal University founded the Research Center on Chinese Comfort Women. It was not merely an archive, it was an institutional response to the Japanese strategy of erasure. While documents were being destroyed and deniers built alternative narratives, researchers began to collect, catalog, and preserve every testimony, every photograph, every surviving record. Memory is a form of active resistance. With the support of the TWRF, Taiwanese survivors secured the backing of their own government, which, on several occasions, formally demanded apologies and compensation from Japan. What Korean and Chinese survivors sought in the courts, Taiwanese survivors achieved at least in the institutional discourse of their government. It was not full justice, but it was official recognition, and recognition, for women who spent decades invisible, was not a small thing. The real number of victims will never be known. Estimates vary between 80,000 and 200,000 women, a margin of uncertainty of more than 100,000 human beings. That imprecision is not a failure of historical research. It is a direct consequence of the systematic burning of Japanese documents at the end of the war. Japan destroyed the archive of its own crime. The exact dimension of the horror was buried along with the papers that recorded it. Many survivors died waiting for the recognition that never came. Each death was one more silenced testimony, one more voice that could no longer confront deniers in hearings. Time was Japan's ally, and the enemy of the women. The urgency they felt was not impatience. It was the awareness that the clock was running, that the window for truth was closing with every funeral, and that history, without guardians, bends toward those who have the power to rewrite it. Today, the number of registered survivors is minimal. Women who were 20 years old in 1942 would be over 100 now. The generation that lived through it is almost entirely dead. What remains are recorded testimonies, collected documents, research done against the clock. And the question that lingers, when the last survivor dies, who will prevent denial from winning? Memory does not sustain itself. It needs guardians in every generation.